Karen didn't storm into power. She volunteered. That's how it started. The playground needed repairs. The landscaping vendor had quit. Dues hadn't increased in years. She presented herself as organized, efficient, experienced. I work in contracts, she told everyone during her campaign speech. I understand structure. We believed her. When she proposed updating the HOA service agreements to modernize vendor relationships, it sounded reasonable. The old contracts were nearly a decade outdated. Insurance requirements were minimal, maintenance timelines vague. She said she had drafted improved versions, more protection for residents, clearer enforcement language, better vendor accountability. The board approved the revisions quickly. Most didn't read the full 38-page document. We skimmed the summary email Karen sent. Stronger compliance language, streamlined enforcement authority, financial flexibility for emergencies. It sounded responsible, professional, necessary. The vote passed overwhelmingly. The new contract took effect at the start of the fiscal year. The first sign something had changed came quietly. A homeowner received a violation notice for fence discoloration, not damage. Discoloration. The fine referenced Revised Aesthetic Preservation Clause, Section 4.2b. No one remembered that clause. Then came another violation, and another. And then the assessments started increasing, because buried inside the revised contract was a restructuring of how enforcement revenue could be allocated. Instead of going strictly into reserve funds, it could now be used for operational stabilization initiatives, which meant fines could fund more enforcement, and enforcement could justify more fines. It was subtle, technical, legal, and we had all voted yes. We didn't realize we hadn't just approved a vendor update. We had approved a power expansion, and Karen held the pen. Here's your script. Read word for word. The language wasn't dramatic. That was the brilliance of it. No bold warnings, no alarming headlines, just carefully structured paragraphs redefining authority. Section 5.7, Enforcement Discretion. The president may interpret aesthetic compliance standards in alignment with community preservation objectives. Interpret, alignment, objectives. Three vague words, unlimited flexibility. Previously, enforcement required majority board review. Now, the president could issue provisional violations independently. Provisional, another harmless word, except provisional fines were immediately payable pending appeal, and appeals required a $200 filing deposit. Non-refundable, even if you won. That's when we realized the structure wasn't about compliance, it was about deterrence. If contesting a fine cost more than paying it, most residents would just pay, and they did. Mailbox paint shade too dark, $125. Holiday decorations displayed 48 hours too long, $150. Driveway microcracks classified as surface deterioration, $200. Every notice cited the revised contract, the one we trusted. Neighbors began whispering in driveways, quiet frustration, but also embarrassment, because admitting you didn't read what you voted on feels irresponsible. Then came the quarterly financial report. Enforcement revenue had tripled. Operational Stabilization Fund showed a surplus, and under new allocation rules, that surplus could fund discretionary community initiatives approved by the president, including compliance technology upgrades, which meant more inspections, more monitoring, more fines. It wasn't corruption in the obvious sense. It was structural advantage, built legally, activated quietly. We hadn't signed a hostile takeover. We had signed a mechanism, and mechanisms don't feel threatening until they start moving. Karen assumed frustration would fade. She underestimated pattern recognition. One neighbor worked in compliance law, another in municipal governance. I worked in financial oversight. When you review documents for a living, you don't argue emotionally. You trace language. We compared the old contract to the new one line by line. That's when we found it. Section 9.4, Indemnification Adjustment. Board members were granted expanded liability protection for actions taken in good faith interpretation of preservation standards, which meant even aggressive enforcement would be shielded unless proven malicious. And proving malicious intent is nearly impossible. But something else stood out. The vendor management clause. A new consulting firm had been contracted to assist in compliance optimization, owned by someone with the same last name as Karen. Not illegal, but undisclosed. Conflict of interest requires transparency. Transparency requires disclosure. There was none in the meeting minutes. So we requested official records. The request was delayed, then partially fulfilled. Redacted, that's when we brought in an independent HOA attorney. His assessment was measured. The contract isn't inherently unlawful, but procedural approval requirements for conflict disclosures may not have been satisfied. Translation: the foundation might be cracked. We didn't rally the neighborhood with outrage. We circulated documentation, highlighted sections, side-by-side comparisons, numbers. Data removes emotion, and emotion had been Karen's advantage. At the next meeting, attendance doubled, not with anger, with binders, and for the first time, she wasn't the only one referencing sections. The special meeting lasted 3 hours. No shouting, no theatrics, just questions, direct, precise. Was the consulting relationship disclosed prior to contract adoption? Silence. Was the indemnification clause expansion reviewed by independent counsel before member vote? Pause. Why was enforcement revenue reallocation not highlighted in the summary email? No clear answer. The attorney present reviewed the procedural record. Conflict disclosures had not been formally documented. Vote summaries had omitted material financial restructuring details, which meant members may not have been fully informed at the time of approval, and in contract law, informed consent matters. The board voted to suspend the revised enforcement clauses pending review. An independent audit was commissioned. The consulting contract was terminated. Fines issued under discretionary expansion were refunded. The financial cost to the HOA? Significant. Legal review, administrative correction, reimbursement checks. The financial cost to Karen? Her presidency. Removed in a follow-up vote, but the most expensive part wasn't money. It was trust, because contracts are supposed to protect communities, not consolidate authority. We trusted HOA Karen's contract, and it nearly restructured our neighborhood into something unrecognizable. The mistake wasn't voting, it wasn't believing. It was assuming leadership summaries replace personal responsibility. Contracts don't have intentions. People do. And when you sign something without reading it, you're not delegating responsibility. You're surrendering it. If you've ever trusted a document because someone said it's standard and later discovered it wasn't, share your experience. Because sometimes the most expensive mistake, like share and subscribe, is the signature you give too quickly.